The wind cut low across the prairie, steady and mean, lifting dust in long ribbons that curled over the fresh mound of earth. Mara Fallon knelt in the grit, her knees sunk into dry soil, hands raw from clawing at ground that gave nothing back. The taste of dirt coated her tongue. It clung to the back of her throat like something she might choke on, but she didn't move. Not yet. Not until she could feel something more than the dull ache in her chest. The townsfolk had already drifted away, their boots scuffing in slow retreat, their whispers scattering with the wind. No one ever lingered for her. The preacher had mumbled his lines, his voice lost under the groan of the weather, and then they'd lowered the tiny bundle into the hole she'd dug herself. A stillborn child, they'd said. God's will. Best not to dwell. The wooden cross stood crooked, one arm shorter than the other, the letters of the name she never got to speak scratched into it with the dull tip of a nail. She didn't read it. She just stared at the soil, watching the top layer dry under the sun, while the dirt beneath stayed dark and damp. Her fingers sifted through it, slow, mechanical, as if by touch alone she could reach the small, wrapped body and pull her daughter back into her arms. Heat shimmered off the prairie grass, bending the horizon into a wavering mirage. Somewhere behind her, the saloon doors creaked, and a man laughed sharp enough to cut through the wind. A horse snorted, a spur jingled, and then all of it faded again, leaving her with nothing but the hiss of grit against her dress. She didn't cry. She hadn't, since the moment they took the child from her arms without letting her look. The midwife's face had been unreadable, her hands brisk, her voice final. "It's gone," she'd said, and that was the end of it. Until the shadow fell across her. It stretched long over the mound, blocking the glare, cool against her bent neck. She lifted her head slowly, half expecting another gawker come to shake their head at the poor fool still kneeling in the dirt. Instead, a tall man stood there, still as a post, his hat brim low enough to hide most of his face. His coat was travel-worn, dust caked into the seams, and the skin at his throat was the warm brown of someone who lived under the sun. To Yazi didn't clear his throat or shift his weight. He just watched her, his gaze steady, unblinking. When he spoke, his voice was calm, deep, certain. "Your child is still breathing." The words landed in her chest like a shot, tearing through the dull numbness and leaving something wild in its place. Her mouth opened, but nothing came. She searched his face for cruelty, for madness, for anything that might explain why a stranger would say such a thing to a woman who'd just buried her child. But Yazi's eyes didn't flicker. He looked not at her, but at the mound, as if the earth itself had told him a secret. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of cedar and horse sweat from his coat. She felt her pulse in her throat, fast and sick. "Don't," she rasped, her voice breaking on the word. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, and knelt beside her. The shadow of his hat fell across the mound as his calloused hands pressed into the dirt. "She's breathing," he said again. Quieter now, as if speaking to the soil. "Help me dig." Her body moved before her mind caught up. Fingers tore at the earth, nails breaking, grit grinding into her skin. The mound gave way, dark soil turning cold and damp the deeper they went. Her breath came ragged, sharp. The whole time Yazi's hands worked beside hers, steady, unhurried, but with the weight of someone who didn't waste effort on lies. Somewhere beneath, wrapped in the midwife's old quilt, the earth shifted. And then faint, fragile, impossible breath. The words hit her so hard she almost toppled backward. For a heartbeat, she thought it was some vicious joke, the kind of cruelty small towns dealt out without blinking. But Yazi's face held no mockery, no pity, only the fixed determination of a man who knew what he was saying. Before she could protest, he was already on his knees, shoving his hands into the mound, fingers cutting into the damp soil. Mara's shock cracked wide open into panic. She threw herself forward, digging beside him, nails tearing against stones, dirt grinding into her bleeding knuckles. The earth was packed tighter than she remembered, They'd buried her child like they meant for her never to see her again. Her breaths came sharp and shallow, each scoop of dirt flinging her closer to hope or heartbreak. At the edge of the main street, a few townsfolk lingered, their faces unreadable. The blacksmith leaned against his doorway, arms crossed. The midwife's husband stood stiff as a fence post, jaw tight, eyes locked on Yazi. The sheriff wandered up, hat low, chewing slow on a toothpick. Crazy Indian talk, he muttered, as if the words could settle the matter, then turned and walked away without lifting a finger. Mara's chest burned. Every scrape of her fingers was a prayer, every handful of dirt a plea. Yazi didn't speak, didn't glance at her. His hands moved with relentless rhythm, pulling the earth away in wide sweeps. Then his palm struck something soft, a frayed corner of quilt. He froze for only a second, then brushed the soil from it and worked carefully, peeling back the dirt that clung to the folds. When the tiny bundle emerged, her heart seized. The quilt was damp, heavy, the faded rose pattern smeared with soil. Yazi cradled it in both hands, kneeling there in the churned dirt like a man holding something the wind might steal. He pulled the fabric back just enough for Mara to see her daughter's face pale, lips faintly blue, but the chest moving. Not much, barely there, but moving. Her breath ripped out of her in a shudder, and for a moment she couldn't pull another in. The ground tilted under her knees. She reached out, touching the edge of the quilt as if it might vanish. Yazi's voice cut through the pounding in her ears. She's alive. The words stripped her bare. Alive. Not a ghost. Not a memory to carry like a stone in her gut. Her throat, locked on a sob she couldn't let loose. Yazi pulled the baby close against his own chest, wrapping her in the heavy wool coat he'd shrugged from his shoulders. The fabric swallowed her, holding in what warmth the prairie wind tried to steal. He stood in one smooth motion and looked down at Mara. We ride, now. She blinked up at him, dirt streaking her face, confusion tangling with the wild thrum of hope in her veins. Where? Somewhere they won't finish what they started. His tone was flat, final. He offered a hand. For the first time in hours, she stood without feeling the weight of the earth holding her down. In the distance, the wind carried the sound of a horse's restless snort, and the faint metallic rattle of spurs moving closer. The sky was a hard, pitiless blue when they broke from the edge of town, Yazi's paint horse lunging forward in long, sure strides. Mara clung to the child as if the prairie itself would try to tear her away, the wool coat wrapped tight around them both. The baby's breath was shallow but steady, a fragile rhythm she could feel against her ribs. She pressed her cheek to the top of the small head, willing her own warmth into the tiny body. Yazi didn't look back at first. His focus was fixed ahead, eyes scanning the folds of land, hands loose but ready on the reins. The wind swept past them, snatching at the hem of Mara's skirt and carrying the smell of dust and sage. Behind that wind came another sound, low at first, then sharp enough to cut through the rush in her ears. Hoofbeats, more than one set. She risked a glance over her shoulder. In the far distance, 3 dark figures rode hard, their shapes swelling against the horizon, dust boiling up behind them. The sun caught on a rifle slung across one man's back, flashing like a signal. Mara didn't need to ask who they were. She saw the set of their shoulders, the way they leaned into their saddles, and she knew. Men sent with a job, one they wouldn't leave half done. The wind took whatever words they shouted, but she didn't have to hear them. She could feel the intent, closing like a noose. Her arms tightened around the child until she heard a faint, protesting whimper. She loosened just enough to hush the baby, swaying slightly with the horse's gait. Yazi turned his head, scanning the ridge behind them for only a moment before pulling the reins hard to the right. The paint shifted under him without hesitation, plunging off the faint trail into a slope of loose stone and coarse grass. The shift pitched Mara sideways. She caught herself with one hand against Yazi's back, the other cradling the child tight. The land fell away into a narrow gully, shadowed and cool compared to the sun-scorched ridge above. Sagebrush scraped at her skirts as the horse pushed through. The sound of pursuit dulled, swallowed by the rise of earth on either side. Yazi guided them deeper, the horse picking its way over a floor of sand and scattered rock. The sun's light narrowed above them, the sky just a strip between canyon walls. Mara didn't speak. She could feel the weight of unasked questions pressing at the back of her throat, but her mind clung only to the small, stubborn breath against her chest. She didn't know why the midwife's husband wanted the baby gone, or why Yazi had risked himself to bring her back from the grave. None of it mattered if those riders caught them. The gully widened suddenly, splitting into two narrow arroyos. Yazi chose the left without pause, the paint horse's hooves thudding over packed sand. The air smelled faintly of water, distant, maybe, but there. He leaned low in the saddle, guiding them through a twist so sharp Mara had to brace her legs to keep from slipping. A hawk wheeled high above the cut in the canyon roof, its cry trailing in the wind. Yazi slowed, listening. The hoofbeats behind them had grown faint, then vanished entirely. He didn't relax. His eyes kept moving, mapping the land the way only someone born to it could. The sun was sinking when they climbed out of the arroyo, its last light setting the stones on fire. The horizon stretched endless in every direction, empty but for the long shadow of the horse and the two figures it carried, one steady and unyielding, the other clutching the life she hadn't been ready to lose. Night bled over the prairie like ink poured slow, swallowing the last red edge of the sun until only the chill remained. The air shifted from dry heat to a cold that crept in quiet, slipping through cloth and bone. Yazi guided the paint horse into a basin hidden from the world by high walls of red rock, the kind that kept secrets from the wind. The ground was soft with sand, and scattered with the pale bones of old cedar roots, dry enough to burn clean. He swung down first, his boots landing without sound, and held out a hand for her. Mara slid off stiffly, her knees trembling from the ride, her arms aching from holding the baby tight for so many miles. Yazi didn't speak, only unlashed a small bundle from the saddle and crouched near a low patch of cleared earth. She watched as he built the fire like it was a craft, each cedar root laid with care, the tinder chosen from the soft, curled shavings of bark. He struck flint to steel, catching the spark on dry moss. It flared, small and stubborn, and he cupped his hands around it, feeding it breath until the cedar caught. The smoke rose thin and sharp, curling into the night air like a whisper meant for the stars alone. Mara eased herself down onto a folded blanket Yazi had set without a word. The baby stirred against her chest, fussing softly. Yazi reached into his pack and drew out a skin pouch, the leather worn smooth from years of use. "Goat's milk," he said, passing it to her. She hesitated. Milk was milk, but the pouch smelled faintly of sage and smoke. Still, when she let a few drops fall against the baby's lips, the child latched weakly, taking in more than Mara thought she could. The warmth of the fire seeped into her legs, chasing back the edge of the night's cold. She watched Yazi feed another root into the flames, his movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice thin. "Why would you help me? When no one else would even look at me?" He didn't glance up, didn't smile, didn't shrug, because the wind told me to. There was no trace of jest in his tone. The words settled between them, heavy as stone. Mara didn't know what to make of them, but something in her chest loosened at the way he said it, like it wasn't a reason that needed explaining. The firelight painted his face in copper and shadow. She saw the sharp lines of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that had held hers without flinching in the graveyard, and the map of scars across his handsome, pale and old, others fresh. There was a welt on his temple, a swollen ridge that caught the light when he turned to check the darkness beyond the basin. The baby shifted, a small sound escaping her. Mara looked down and caught her breath. Two tiny eyes, dark as wet earth, blinked up at her for the first time. For a moment, the world narrowed to just father-daughter's gaze and the faint warmth of her breath against Mara's skin. Somewhere beyond the red rock walls, the wind moved again, brushing over the basin with a sound that could have been leaves or could have been something else entirely. Yazi listened, head tilted slightly, then fed the fire one last root before sitting back. In the glow, the basin felt like the only safe place left on the prairie. The fire had burned down to a low, steady glow, the cedar roots collapsing into embers that pulsed red against the dark. Above them, the sky was crowded with stars, cold and sharp as glass. Mara sat with her knees drawn up, the baby curled in her lap, her tiny breaths warm through the wool coat. She should have been too exhausted to speak, but the quiet between them pressed on her, heavy with things unsaid. Yazi broke it first. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone. "I saw her chest move," he said, eyes fixed on the coals, when no one else was looking. He let the words settle for a moment before adding, "Life doesn't give up easy, not if it's meant to stay." Mara swallowed hard. Her mind pulled her back to the cramped, airless room in the back of the midwife's house. She could still feel the damp heat of the blankets, the smell of boiled linen, the pounding in her head as they told her it was over. "They didn't even let me hold her," she whispered. "She came too fast. I was bleeding. I asked, but—" Her throat tightened. The midwife just said it was God's will, that she was gone before she even touched air. Yazi glanced at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. She could feel him weighing her words, not for truth, but for what they meant. "She's been in that town longer than I've been alive," Mara continued, bitterness edging her tone. "Her family's tied into everything, the store, the sheriff's office, even the church. People don't cross her, not unless they want trouble. No one dared to question her word." Yazi leaned forward, feeding a thin branch into the fire. The flames licked higher, briefly lighting the planes of his face. "It wasn't just her word," he said quietly. "There's more to it." Mara looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if deciding whether to tell her, then spoke like a man who had no use for gentle truths. "Rig Holt." The name was a stone dropped into the basin's stillness. "Cattle foreman. Wears his hat low so you don't see his eyes. That your child's father?" Her stomach knotted, and she turned her gaze back to the fire. "He was," she admitted, "before I knew what he was capable of." Yazi's voice didn't soften. "I've heard his kind before. He left you for dead months ago, didn't he?" Mara didn't answer right away. The wind outside the basin whistled through the rocks, like it might carry her silence away. Finally, she nodded. "He said he'd send for me, never did. And when I showed up in town again, belly full and alone." She shook her head. "He made sure folks knew what kind of woman I was, or what he wanted them to think." "That child," Yazi said, his tone as certain as it had been in the graveyard, "is the one thing he can't control. That's reason enough for him to erase her." The fire popped, sending up a small flurry of sparks. Mara's hand tightened around the bundle in her lap. Out beyond the red rock walls, a coyote's call rose into the night long, mournful, answered by another farther off. The sound echoed in the hollow of her chest. She glanced at Yazi, the flicker of the fire between them, and realized that whatever came next, she could no longer pretend she was only running from the wind. The first light of day came thin and gray, the kind that blurred the edges of things and made the land look older than it was. Yazi guided the paint horse down a slope of shale into a shallow creek bed, the hooves splashing into water so clear Mara could see the pebbles shift beneath the current. The air was colder here, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of iron. She slid down carefully, her legs stiff from the night, clutching the bundled baby to her chest. Yazi crouched by the bank and dipped his hands into the stream, lifting water to his face. Mara knelt beside him, cupping a handful for herself. It bit cold against her skin, clean but with that faint taste of blood the earth sometimes left in its veins. She let the baby's lips touch the edge of her palm, just enough for a few drops to dampen them. That was when she saw it pressed into the wet sand on the far bank, the shape of a hoofprint. Not old, not softened by rain or wind. She looked upstream, her eyes catching more of them, scattered in patterns that spoke of a group moving together. Too many for the 3 riders she'd seen before. Her pulse picked up. "There's more," she said quietly. Yazi followed her gaze, his jaw tightening as he studied the marks. "They have help now." The words carried no surprise, only the flat weight of confirmation. He stood and scanned the banks as if reading a page she couldn't see. The breeze stirred the hem of his coat, and she caught the faint twitch of his fingers, the same twitch she'd seen before he'd decided to change trails the night before. He came back to her and knelt, pulling a long strip of cloth from his pack. "You need your hands free," he said. He showed her how to lay the baby against her chest, high enough that her chin could rest on the soft crown of the tiny head. The cloth crossed over her shoulders, looped under the child, and tied tight at her back, binding her close. The sling was snug, warm, and made her feel as though the child was part of her again, instead of something she might drop if she stumbled. Yazi reached into the deep pocket of his coat and brought out a knife no longer than her palm. The blade was worn but clean, the handle smooth from years of use. He took her hand and set the knife into it, curling her fingers around the hilt. His touch was firm, deliberate. "Don't think," he told her. "Use it if you must." Her mouth went dry. She wanted to tell him she'd never cut more than twine, never drawn blood that wasn't her own, but his eyes held her steady, and she nodded. The wind shifted then, turning cool against the back of her neck. It carried something beneath the scent of water and rocked the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves. Mara froze, her breath catching. Yazi's head tilted, listening. The sound was still distant, but it was coming closer, threading through the stillness like a slow drumbeat. He rose without a word, scanning the narrow cuts in the land beyond the creek. The baby stirred in her sling, warm against her, and Mara's fingers tightened around the knife handle. The horses were getting louder. The cottonwoods rose out of the prairie like a patch of memory, their trunks thick and pale, leaves whispering in a wind that barely touched the open ground. Yazi led the paint horse in slow, his gaze sweeping the shadows beneath the branches. He'd trapped here once in a winter, so cold the creeks froze solid, he'd told her earlier, a place where the land itself could hide you if you knew how to ask it. But this morning, it felt less like shelter, and more like a stage. The hoofbeats found them before the men did. A low, steady drumbeat, growing sharper as it closed in, until 5 riders broke through the wavering heat. They fanned out as they approached, dust swirling up around their horses' legs. Mara counted them automatically 3 strangers, the 2 cousins from before, and then she saw him. Rig Holt rode in the middle, sitting his bay like it was carved for him alone. He looked almost exactly as she remembered, clean-shaven jaw, pale eyes that didn't warm in the sun, and that smile thin, practiced, cutting deeper than any blade. He reined in a few paces away, boots sliding forward in the stirrups as he leaned on the horn of his saddle. "Should have left the brat where she belonged," he called, voice carrying easy through the cottonwoods. The words hit harder than the ride had, harder than the cold mornings and the hunger. Mara's arms tightened around the baby in her sling until the child gave a soft, protesting sound. Yazi stepped forward, putting himself between her and the riders. His rifle hung low in his hands, barrel angled toward the dirt, but his stance made it clear he could lift it in half a breath. The strangers shifted in their saddles, eyes darting between him and Rig. Tension hung in the air like a wire drawn too tight. Mara could hear her own pulse in her ears, could feel her heart pounding all the way into her fingertips. Rig swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, boots thudding against the ground. He didn't hurry, didn't need to. His right hand drifted toward the butt of his gun, fingers brushing the worn grip like an old friend. The baby whimpered again, a small, thin sound that seemed to cut the air. Yazi's stillness shattered Ednot into sudden movement, but into something sharper. His head lifted just enough, his shoulders squaring. The line of his body said he'd heard the sound and decided, in that instant, what it meant. "Hand her over," Rig said, taking another step. No, Mara breathed before she realized she'd spoken. Rig's eyes slid past Yazi to her. You think this ends any way but mine? Yazi's voice came low, even, the kind of tone that carried farther than a shout. You take one more step, Holt, and you'll be the one left in the ground. The leaves rattled above them, though the wind had died. No one moved. The horses shifted, tails swishing. Mara's hand tightened around the knife in her sling, the hilt slick with sweat. Rig's smile faltered just enough for her to see the man behind it, the one who knew that some things, once broken, didn't get put back together. The crack of the first shot split the air, sharp as a whip. A chunk of bark exploded from the cottonwood trunk inches above Mara's head, showering her hair with splinters. The sound tore her breath from her throat before she even registered the flash of the muzzle. Rig's cousin had fired high, aiming to scare, but the nearness of it was enough to make her body jolt as if struck. Yazi didn't flinch. He moved in the same instant, his stillness folding into something swift and fluid water that had found its edge. The rifle came up, the report deep and solid in the hollow of the cottonwoods. One rider dropped with a sound that was more grunt than cry, tumbling from his saddle into the dust. Before the others could react, Yazi shifted his aim, the second shot cutting through the air and finding its mark. Another horse danced sideways, its rider crumpling from the stirrups. The smell of powder clung to the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the squeal of leather and the snort of panicked horses. Mara pressed her back against the rough trunk of a cottonwood, curling herself over the baby. The child whimpered, her small body jerking at the noise, and Mara's own heart seemed to match the frantic rhythm. Rig was moving. She saw him through the blur of adrenaline, his boots digging into the dirt, his frame cutting across the narrow space between them. His hand was at his side, not for his pistol now but reaching for her, a snarl twisting his mouth. Instinct rose faster than thought. Her fingers closed around the small knife Yazi had given her. The hilt was slick, the weight foreign, but when Rig's shadow fell over her, her arm moved without asking permission. The blade sank into the flesh just above his collarbone, the resistance hot and alive under her grip. He let out a sound that was part curse, part animal howl, stumbling backward as his hand flew to the wound. Blood spread in a sudden bloom, dark against the pale fabric of his shirt. Mara's breath came ragged. She held the knife tight, the baby's weight, a trembling anchor against her chest. Rig's eyes found hers, and in them she saw not shock, but a kind of disbelief that she'd dared, that she'd met him with something other than fear. He staggered once, twice, and that was all the space Yazi needed. There was no warning, no barked threat. Yazi's rifle barked a third time, the sound sharp and final. Rig dropped to his knees, the dust puffing up around him before he pitched forward onto his hands. He stayed there a breath too long, head bowed as if in prayer, then collapsed sideways into the dirt. The clearing went quiet, except for the ringing in Mara's ears. The remaining riders, those still on their mount, hung back, faces tight, reins twitching in their hands. Yazi didn't raise the rifle again. He didn't have to. His eyes moved over them, cold and unwavering, and one by one they turned their horses and rode. Mara felt her knees weaken, the tree at her back holding her up. She slid down it slowly, still clutching the knife, still cradling the baby. Yazi stepped to her, his shadow falling across them both. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The work was done, the danger, for now, was over. But in the way he looked past her, toward the bodies cooling in the shade, she could tell he knew it would not be the last time they'd have to fight to keep the child breathing. The ground beneath the cottonwoods was soft enough to take a shovel, but stubborn enough to make you earn each inch. Yazi worked without pause, the muscles in his shoulders rolling with every lift and turn. His hands didn't hesitate, didn't slow. He dug like a man who had done this before, who understood the finality of the work and carried no illusions about it. Mara stood a few paces away, rocking the baby in the sling across her chest. The child's breaths were small but steady, her lashes fluttering against her cheek. A smear of dirt clung to the baby's temple, left from when Mara had dropped to the ground during the shooting. She wiped it away with her thumb, the motion gentle, though her fingers trembled. The sun had climbed higher, filtering through the cottonwood leaves in broken patches. The air smelled of churned earth and gunpowder, the two scents knotting together until she couldn't tell them apart. The horses grazed nearby, untethered but not straying far, their tails swishing against the flies. When Yazi finished the first grave, he walked to the nearest body, bent, and took the man under the arms. He dragged him across the dust without ceremony, without slowing to glance at his face. The sound of the body sliding over the ground made something in Mara's stomach twist. She turned slightly, pressing her lips to the baby's head as if the child could sense the heaviness of the air. The second grave went faster, Yazi's rhythm never faltering. He didn't speak until the last mound was patted down, the fresh dirt lying in dark, uneven humps. He stood over them for a long moment, then wiped his palms on his trousers, the grit catching in the lines of his skin. "What happens now?" Mara asked. Her voice felt strange in the stillness, too loud even though it came out soft. He looked at her then, his eyes steady in the shade. "We take the long trail," he said, "to my people." "Why there?" she asked, shifting the baby's weight against her. "Because the wind carries truth there," he said, "and no one decides if a child should live but the Creator." The words settled over her like a blanket trough in their honesty, but warm all the same. She glanced toward the horizon, the way back to town shimmering in the heat. The air wavered above the distant rise, making the rooftops look like something imagined instead of real. She knew, as surely as she knew the weight of the child against her, that she would never set foot there again. She had no grave to visit there, no name to reclaim, no one who would look at her without seeing shame. The people who'd watched her dig a hole for her living child would keep watching, would keep whispering, until there was nothing left of her but the story they told. Yazi walked past her to gather the horses. She followed, not because he'd told her to, but because the trail ahead was the only one that didn't end in a grave. As the cottonwoods faded behind them, the wind picked up, stirring the dust from the fresh mounds and carrying it out into the open prairie. The valley opened beneath them like a secret laid bare, the hills rolling down into a sweep of wild sage and grass that shimmered gold in the morning sun. The air here was different, softer, warmer, carrying the faint sweetness of blooming things. Mara breathed it in, as though it might settle deep enough to loosen the knots inside her chest. They'd been traveling for days, each mile pulling them farther from the cottonwoods, from the graves, from the eyes that had watched her dig in silence. Out here, the only eyes belonged to the hawks circling high above, and the shy mule deer that vanished into the brush at their passing. They made camp in a hollow where a small stream cut through the grass. The water ran clear and quick over smooth stones, the sound blending with the whisper of the wind through the sage. Yazi had spoken little on the trail, but his silences no longer felt like walls. They felt like the space between heartbeats, steady and necessary. A Navajo woman came from the far end of the valley, walking with the sure step of someone who belonged entirely to the land beneath her feet. Her hair was streaked with silver, tied low against her back, and her eyes were warm but sharp. She greeted Yazi with a single clasp of hands, and then turned to Mara, looking her over in a way that saw more than just the dust on her skirt or the sling across her chest. Without a word, she sat beside Mara and unrolled a bundle of willow strips and leather ties. She picked up a strip, bent it gently, and began to weave. Her hands moved with a rhythm older than either of them, each pull and knot precise. Mara watched, hesitant at first, until the woman handed her a strip and motioned for her to try. Her fingers fumbled in the beginning, clumsy against the smooth wood, but the older woman's patience was as constant as the sun overhead. Slowly, the pattern began to take shape under Mara's hands. The movement settled into her like something remembered, not learned a rhythm she thought she'd lost long before her daughter ever drew breath. In the shade of a cottonwood at the edge of the stream, Yazi sat cross-legged with his back to the trunk, a small block of wood in his hands. His knife moved with quiet precision, shavings curling away into his lap. Bit by bit, the block became a bird's slender beak, outstretched wings, its form emerging as though it had been waiting inside the wood all along. The baby stirred in the sling, her breaths now stronger, more certain, the shallow rasp replaced by the soft, steady rhythm of new life finding its place in the world. Mara slipped her fingers over the downy curve of her daughter's head, feeling the warmth there, the pulse beneath the skin. She leaned down and pressed her lips to the child's forehead. "They tried to bury you," she whispered, her voice carrying only to the space between them. Then, with more weight, steadier, "But you were never meant to be under the earth." When she looked up, Yazi was watching her from the shade. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but he gave a single nod, slow and certain. It was the kind of nod that held both an ending and a beginning, the kind that told her the wind had carried them exactly where they were meant to be. The sage stirred around them, the valley breathing in time with the child in her arms.